Welcome to this recollection of one of the most disturbing cases registered in the history of Arizona's frontier territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you're watching and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1892, and the sprawling deserts of Arizona Territory harbored secrets as deadly as its scorpions. The mining towns that dotted the landscape between Tombstone and Globe were enjoying the prosperity of a copper boom that had replaced the fading silver rushes of the previous decade. But beneath the veneer of progress and civilization lurked a darkness few dared to speak of: the James clan, a family whose brutal legacy would be deliberately obscured from the pages of history. In the shadow of the Superstition Mountains, between the mining operations of Goldfield and the smaller settlements along the Apache Trail, the James family established themselves not as infamous outlaws, but as respected citizens with political connections that reached as far as the territorial capital. Unlike their more notorious Missouri namesakes, this James clan operated with chilling precision and absolute discretion. They didn't rob banks in broad daylight or hold up trains with theatrical flair. Their crimes were far more calculated, more personal, and infinitely more disturbing. They were the family that no one ever suspected until it was too late. The winter of 1892 was particularly harsh by Arizona standards. Snow dusted the higher elevations, and bitter winds swept across the desert floor. In a small cabin 10 miles east of the Goldfield mining camp, a lamp burned through the night. By morning, the first of the James clan's secrets would begin its slow, inexorable journey toward the light. This is the story that was deliberately kept from newspaper accounts. This is the history that powerful men conspired to bury. This is the case that drove 3 separate investigators to abandon their careers. This is the James clan's legacy of terror buried by the history books until now. The patriarch, William Thaddeus James, arrived in Arizona Territory in 1883, a man of impeccable manners and mysterious wealth. His wife Sarah, their 3 sons, Thomas, Albert, and young Marcus, and their daughter Eliza, settled in what appeared to be humble circumstances for a family of their means. They purchased a modest property outside the established mining communities, far enough away to avoid scrutiny, but close enough to maintain business connections. William quickly developed a reputation as a shrewd investor in mining operations throughout the region, though he never seemed to dirty his hands with actual mining work. The local newspaper, the Arizona Sentinel, reported in October 1883, "Mr. William T. James, lately arrived from California with his family, has taken considerable interest in several promising claims near Goldfield. Mr. James, a gentleman of evident means and education, expressed to this reporter his confidence in the future prosperity of our territory." The brief article contained no hint of suspicion toward the newcomers, only the typical welcome extended to those bringing capital to the developing region. Within 6 months of his arrival, William James had acquired minority stakes in 3 mining operations between Phoenix and Globe. His investments were modest enough not to draw undue attention, but sufficient to give him access to operational details and financial records. Those who dealt with him found him knowledgeable about mining matters despite his apparent lack of practical experience. He seemed to understand the business remarkably well for someone who presented himself as merely an investor, recalled Edward Hargrove, a mining engineer who encountered James in 1884. He asked the sort of questions that only someone with intimate knowledge of mining operations would think to ask, particularly about security measures and personnel routines. This early period established the pattern that would define the James clan's approach. William was the public face, the respectable businessman whose presence in financial circles raised no alarms. Sarah maintained their home and developed relationships with other prominent wives in the territory, gathering information through seemingly innocent social interactions. The children were educated at home, rarely mixing with their peers, except in carefully controlled circumstances. The cabin remained dark until nearly noon on December 17, 1892. A young miner named Joseph Harland, riding from Goldfield to visit his sweetheart in a neighboring settlement, noticed the unusual stillness. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cold. No movement disturbed the quiet property. Only a single horse shifted nervously in the small corral beside the cabin. Harland later testified that he approached with caution, calling out several times before trying the door. Finding it unlocked, he entered to discover a scene that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His initial statement to authorities was terse, the words of a man in shock. "It isn't right. What was done there? It isn't human. I can't put words to it." What Joseph Harland discovered that day would haunt the territory for decades to come, though most would never know the full extent of the horror. The official record, housed in the Territorial Archive until 1964, when it mysteriously disappeared during a routine transfer of documents, spoke only of a domestic disturbance resulting in death. The actual scene was far worse. The family that had lived in that cabin, the Kramer family, had vanished, save for the father, Elias Kramer, a mining engineer who had recently arrived from Pennsylvania with his wife and 2 children. His body was found seated at the dining table, posed as if enjoying a meal, though he had been dead for at least a day. The authorities later determined that the rest of the family had vanished without a trace. What made the scene particularly disturbing was not just the calculated staging of the body, but what was found beneath the floorboards of the cabin, detailed maps of mining claims throughout the territory, many belonging to operations that had experienced mysterious accidents or unexplained disappearances over the previous 9 years. County physician Dr. Miles Everett performed the examination of Kramer's body at the scene. His report, later sealed by court order, noted, "Subject appears to have died from exsanguination via precise incisions to the femoral and carotid arteries. The clinical nature of the wounds suggests knowledge of human anatomy. Most troubling is evidence of systematic ante-mortem trauma consistent with interrogation methods I observed during my service in the war between the states. In simple terms, Elias Kramer had been tortured before being killed, his blood drained with methodical precision. The perpetrators had then cleaned the scene thoroughly, leaving the body displayed in a macabre tableau. The entire family's personal belongings remained untouched. Clothing in drawers, toys belonging to the children scattered about their room, food stored in the pantry. Only the wife and children were missing. This discovery marked the beginning of a dark journey into the true nature of the James clan, a family whose outward respectability masked a methodical campaign of terror and acquisition that had reshaped the economic landscape of central Arizona without anyone connecting the seemingly random incidents. Sheriff Malcolm Reynolds of Pinal County was the first to recognize the pattern. A former miner himself, Reynolds had investigated numerous accidents in the region's mining operations. Looking at Kramer's hidden collection, he began to see connections where others saw only tragedy. Each map corresponded to a mine that had changed hands following disaster. And behind many of those acquisitions stood the quiet, gentlemanly figure of William Thaddeus James, or one of his shell companies. "I've been investigating unrelated incidents," Reynolds wrote in his personal journal on January 3, 1893. "God help me, I believe I've been tracking the same predator all along." Reynolds was no ordinary frontier lawman. Before accepting the sheriff's position in 1890, he had served as a Pinkerton detective in Chicago and San Francisco, developing a reputation for methodical investigation and unwavering integrity. His appointment had been championed by mining interests seeking protection from the endemic claim jumping and theft that plagued the territory. What they couldn't have anticipated was that Reynolds would uncover a threat far more sophisticated than the typical frontier bandits. The sheriff began reconstructing the James clan's movements across the territory since their arrival, comparing them with reported incidents of violence or mysterious deaths. He worked alone at first, maintaining detailed records in a locked drawer in his office. The connections he discovered disturbed him deeply. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its precision. Wherever the James family settled, even temporarily, misfortune followed their neighbors, particularly those with valuable mining claims or strategic properties. Never anything that pointed directly to the family, just a persistent shadow of tragedy that somehow always benefited William James's business interests. Most disturbing were the disappearances. Between 1883 and 1892, Reynolds documented 17 cases of missing persons in proximity to James family activities. Many were written off as the transient nature of mining communities, men who simply moved on to the next opportunity. But Reynolds began to suspect a more sinister fate had befallen them. One case in particular drew his attention. In 1887, prospector Michael Donovan had discovered a promising vein of silver in the mountains east of Phoenix. Before filing an official claim, Donovan mentioned his find to several people in a saloon, including Albert James, then in his early 20s. 3 days later, Donovan disappeared. His claim was never filed. 2 months after that, a company controlled by William James began mining operations in the exact location Donovan had described. Reynolds' investigation of the Donovan case revealed something even more disturbing. The young prospector had been accompanied by a partner, Samuel Green, who had remained at their camp due to illness the night Donovan visited town. Green was reported to have left the territory shortly after Donovan's disappearance. But when Reynolds tracked down Green's family in Missouri, he discovered they had received a letter from Samuel posted just before his supposed departure. A letter expressing fear and suspicion about strangers showing unusual interest in their claim. The sheriff's suspicions might have remained private speculation had it not been for the arrival of Franklin Mercer, a Pinkerton detective hired by the family of a missing mining investor from San Francisco. Mercer's investigation independently led him to the James family through financial records showing that William James had acquired his client's considerable holdings shortly after the man vanished during a prospecting trip near Globe. Reynolds and Mercer met by chance at the county clerk's office in February 1893, both examining property records connected to the James family's holdings. Recognizing they were pursuing the same quarry, they agreed to share information, a decision that would ultimately cost one of them his life. James presents himself as a gentleman investor, Mercer wrote to his Pinkerton superiors on February 20th, 1893. But his wealth appears built on the misfortune of others. I've documented 12 separate instances where he acquired valuable claims following the death or disappearance of the original owner, too many for coincidence. What neither man yet understood was the true nature of the James clan's operation. William James was merely the public face. The entire family participated in their criminal enterprise, each with specialized roles refined over years of practice. Thomas, the eldest son, handled the financial transactions that laundered their blood money through legitimate businesses. Albert, with his quiet charm, cultivated relationships with potential victims. Young Marcus, barely 20 in 1892, was the family's scout, identifying vulnerable targets and gathering intelligence on mining operations throughout the territory. But it was Sarah and Eliza James who harbored the family's darkest secrets. Behind their respectable facade as a devoted mother and dutiful daughter lay personalities of calculating cruelty. The few fragments of evidence that survived suggest they were responsible for extracting information from victims before their ultimate fate was decided. A partial diary recovered from a collapsed mine shaft near Miami in 1902 contained a chilling passage believed to be written by one of their victims. Mrs. J speaks so softly while she does such terrible things. Her daughter watches and learns. God help me. I've told them everything about the eastern shaft. I pray they keep their promise to let me see my children again. The writer was presumably Harrison Fletcher, a mining engineer, who disappeared in 1889 after discovering a rich copper deposit near Miami. His claim was subsequently acquired by a company linked to William James. The diary's existence was never officially acknowledged in court records, though it was referenced in correspondence between Reynolds and territorial authorities. Eliza James presented a particularly disturbing case study in criminal psychology. Witnesses described her as exceptionally beautiful, well-spoken, and seemingly gentle in demeanor. She often accompanied her father to business meetings where her presence softened the negotiations and disarmed potential opposition. None who encountered her socially could have imagined the role she played in the family's darker activities. A schoolteacher who briefly tutored Eliza in 1885 later told investigators she was remarkably intelligent, particularly in sciences. Her questions about human anatomy were unusually specific for a girl of 15. I attributed it to interest in medicine, perhaps nursing. Now I cannot think of those conversations without shuddering. The investigation gathered momentum through March 1893. Reynolds and Mercer, working quietly to avoid alerting their suspects, began connecting the James family to a series of land acquisitions that followed inexplicable tragedies. They documented how William James had systematically built a small empire of mining interests through what appeared to be ruthless elimination of competitors and original claim holders. Their most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Hattie Wilson, a laundress who had briefly worked for the James household in 1889, approached Sheriff Reynolds with a troubling account. While cleaning the family's quarters, she had discovered a hidden compartment containing personal effects belonging to at least 3 individuals who had disappeared in the area. Terrified, she had immediately quit her position and moved to another settlement, only returning after hearing rumors of an investigation into the family. They seemed so normal, Hattie told Reynolds. That's what frightens me most when I think back on it. They spoke gently to each other at dinner. The children were well-mannered, but sometimes I'd catch them looking at each other in a way that made my blood run cold, like they shared some terrible secret that amused them. Her testimony provided the first direct evidence linking the James clan to the disappearances. Reynolds immediately sent word to Mercer, who was following a lead in Phoenix. The detective promised to return the following day to review Wilson's statement and plan their next steps. Mercer never arrived. His body was discovered 3 days later in a gulch 15 miles outside of town, bearing signs of prolonged interrogation before death. His personal effects, including his notes on the investigation, were missing. Dr. Everett's examination of Mercer's remains revealed methodical torture consistent with the earlier Kramer case. The similarities in technique are unmistakable, he wrote in his confidential report to Reynolds. Whoever killed Kramer also killed Mercer. These are not the actions of common criminals or desperate men. This is the work of individuals who derive satisfaction from the systematic application of pain. The message was clear. The James clan knew they were being investigated and had responded decisively. Reynolds immediately moved Hattie Wilson to protective custody, though the laundress was now nearly paralyzed with fear. "They'll find me," she repeated to Reynolds. "They always find anyone who knows." Her fear proved prophetic. Despite being under guard in a secure room at the county jail, Hattie Wilson was found dead the following morning, apparently from self-administered poison. Reynolds, however, immediately suspected foul play. How had the poison reached her in a locked and guarded cell? The answer suggested a disturbing possibility. The James clan's influence extended into law enforcement itself. Deputy Carl Jennings, who had been on duty the night of Wilson's death, disappeared immediately afterward. His horse was found abandoned 10 miles outside of town. Jennings himself was never seen again. A subsequent investigation of his background revealed he had been hired 6 months earlier on the recommendation of a prominent businessman, an associate of William James. No longer certain whom he could trust, Reynolds committed his accumulated evidence to paper and dispatched it via private courier to the territorial marshal in Prescott, along with a request for immediate assistance. Then he returned to his investigation, now working completely alone. In his final journal entry, dated March 29, 1893, Reynolds wrote, I believe they are watching me now. If I disappear, it will confirm everything I've documented. William James is not merely a criminal. He is something altogether more dangerous. A predator who has built an entire family of predators, operating with impunity within our society. God help us all if they are not stopped. The Territorial Marshal's Office received Reynolds's package on April 3, 1893. The documents contained detailed financial records, witness statements, and the sheriff's own carefully reasoned conclusions about the James clan's criminal activities. It presented a compelling case for immediate action. 3 days later, Territorial Marshal Wesley Hardin arrived in Pinal County with 4 deputies to support Reynolds. But the sheriff was nowhere to be found. His home appeared undisturbed, with breakfast still on the table and his horse in the stable. His office contained no indication of his whereabouts. Sheriff Malcolm Reynolds had vanished as completely as many of the James clan's victims. Hardin immediately attempted to locate the James family, only to discover their property abandoned. Neighbors reported that they had departed suddenly just 2 days earlier, supposedly for business in California. A search of their residence revealed little. The family had been meticulous in removing any incriminating evidence. One discovery, however, proved significant. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in William James's study was a small leather-bound book containing coded entries. When eventually deciphered, it proved to be a record of the family's victims, including approximate locations of remains. Reynolds's name appeared on the final page alongside a single word: necessary. The Territorial Marshal organized a manhunt extending across Arizona and into neighboring territories. Telegrams were sent to law enforcement agencies throughout the West with descriptions of the James family members. For several weeks, reports flowed in of possible sightings, but none led to the fugitives. Then, on May 12, 1893, a stagecoach was robbed 15 miles outside Tombstone. The driver and 2 passengers were killed, but a third passenger, a young woman named Elizabeth Collins, managed to hide beneath the coach during the attack. Her description of the assailants matched the James brothers Thomas and Albert. They were so cold, she later testified. They didn't shout or seem angry like most bandits. They spoke quietly to each other while they shot the driver. Then they methodically killed the passengers. They searched each body carefully, as if looking for something specific. This marked a significant change in the James clan's pattern. Previously, they had operated with subtlety, leaving few witnesses and maintaining their respectable facade. Now, forced into the open, they had become brazenly violent. Law enforcement throughout the territory was alerted to their dangerous potential. The Collins testimony provided another disturbing detail. Before departing, one of the brothers had said to the other, "Father won't approve of this, but we needed funds. The arrangements in Mexico will be expensive." This suggested the family had a predetermined escape plan, possibly involving crossing the border where U.S. law enforcement would have limited reach. 2 weeks later, a prospector reported encountering a well-dressed older couple matching the description of William and Sarah James at an isolated cabin near the Mogollon Rim. By the time authorities arrived, the cabin was empty, but evidence suggested recent occupation. More disturbing were the fresh graves discovered nearby. Exhumation revealed the bodies of a family of 4, likely homesteaders from the area who had been missing for several days. The pattern of torture evident on the adult victims matched the methodology seen in previous cases linked to the James clan. Most disturbing was the condition of the children's remains, which suggested they had been forced to watch their parents' suffering before their own deaths. This level of calculated cruelty shocked even the hardened lawmen who discovered the scene. "I've dealt with cold-blooded killers before," Deputy Marshal Samuel Jenkins wrote in his report, "but this is something different. There's a deliberate science to their methods. They don't kill in passion or for simple gain. They seem to extract something beyond information from their victims' suffering." The manhunt intensified through the summer of 1893, with posses combing the rugged landscape between the mining communities. Sightings continued to be reported, always just behind the family's movements. The James clan had transformed from respected citizens to notorious fugitives, yet somehow maintained their ability to evade capture. In late August, the eldest son, Thomas James, was finally cornered by a posse near the town of Miami. Rather than surrender, he engaged in a gun battle that left 2 deputies wounded before he was killed. Documents found in his possession included a coded ledger that, when eventually deciphered, provided the first comprehensive accounting of the family's criminal enterprise. The ledger detailed mining properties acquired through elimination of their owners, with estimated values and projected returns. It referenced at least 26 murders or disappearances orchestrated by the family over their decade in Arizona territory. Most chillingly, it included a section labeled Special Extractions, apparently referring to information obtained through torture from victims who possessed valuable knowledge about mining operations. The ledger also contained references to associates throughout the territory, merchants, bankers, and minor officials who had been bribed or blackmailed into cooperation with the family's activities. Several prominent names appeared, suggesting the James clan's influence extended further into territorial society than investigators had suspected. One passage particularly disturbed Marshall Hardin: maintained regional influence through strategic application of fear and finance. Annual distribution of funds to key positions ensures continued operational security. This systematic corruption explained how the family had operated undetected for so long, and suggested that even now, fugitives though they were, they might still have allies working to protect them. Following Thomas James's death, sightings of the remaining family members became scarce. Law enforcement gradually shifted focus to other priorities as weeks passed without incident. By November 1893, the active manhunt was reduced to periodic bulletins to local sheriffs. The case might have faded entirely from public consciousness had it not been for the discovery made in January 1894 by a hunting party in the Superstition Mountains, deep in a narrow canyon, accessible only through a winding path that was easily overlooked. They found an abandoned camp. What they initially took for a miner's claim turned out to be something far more sinister. The camp contained a small cabin and an adjacent structure that one of the hunters, a former military surgeon, immediately recognized as a purpose-built torture chamber. The walls were soundproofed with layers of burlap. Metal rings were embedded in the floor, and a heavy table. Various implements whose purpose could only be guessed at had been carefully arranged on shelves. Most disturbing were the detailed journals found hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Written primarily in Sarah James's meticulous hand, they documented in clinical detail the questioning of numerous individuals over the years. The information extracted, primarily about mining operations, claim boundaries, and ore quality, had apparently guided the family's acquisition strategy throughout the territory. The journals revealed that what law enforcement had interpreted as opportunistic predation was actually a systematic campaign. The James clan had arrived in Arizona territory with the explicit purpose of building a mining empire through elimination of legitimate claim holders. They selected targets carefully, investigated thoroughly, and executed their plans with precision. Sarah's entries displayed neither remorse nor excitement, just methodical documentation of effective techniques and valuable information obtained. Her daughter Eliza had apparently been apprenticed to this gruesome work, with later entries noting her increasing skill and creative approaches. Perhaps most disturbing was the clinical detachment with which Sarah described her victim's suffering. One entry read, "Subject P resisted longer than anticipated. Technique 4 proved ineffective until applied simultaneously with Technique 7. Information obtained regarding Eastern claim boundaries exceeds expectations. Subject expired at approximately 10:17 p.m. Disposal conducted as per standard procedure." Another entry, apparently referring to Sheriff Reynolds, noted, "Subject R demonstrated exceptional resilience. Military background suspected given response to conventional methods. Eliza's innovation with electrical application proved decisive. Subject provided confirmation of document locations before expiration. Marcus handled disposal with commendable efficiency. When territorial authorities arrived to investigate the site, they discovered an even more grisly aspect to the camp. Behind the cabin, partially concealed by brush and rockfalls, was what appeared to be a burial ground. Initial excavation revealed human remains in various states of decomposition, the first physical evidence of the fate that had befallen many of the clan's victims. Due to the difficult terrain and approaching winter weather, a complete excavation was postponed until spring. By the time authorities returned in April 1894, flooding had washed away much of the site, leaving only fragments of evidence. The true count of victims interred there would never be known with certainty. Marshal Hardin's report to the territorial governor, later classified and sealed in the interest of public order, estimated that the James clan might have been responsible for as many as 40 deaths during their decade in Arizona. The financial impact of their activities was equally staggering. Property worth millions had changed hands as a result of their campaign of targeted elimination. This family, Hardin wrote, represents a new and disturbing development in criminal enterprise. Unlike the random violence of typical outlaws, they operated with business-like precision, selecting victims based on potential profit and dispatching them with methodical efficiency. Most disturbing is the evidence that they trained their children in these practices, creating what amounts to a multi-generational criminal organization. Throughout 1894, sporadic reports placed the remaining James family members in locations from California to New Mexico, though none could be confirmed. William James was reportedly seen in San Francisco, Albert in Santa Fe, while Sarah, Eliza, and young Marcus seemed to have vanished completely. Then, in December 1894, a startling development occurred. A letter arrived at the office of the Arizona Sentinel newspaper in Phoenix, purportedly from William Thaddeus James himself. The letter denied any wrongdoing by the family and claimed they were victims of a conspiracy by mining interests jealous of their success. It accused the deceased Sheriff Reynolds of fabricating evidence and suggested that Thomas had been murdered rather than killed resisting arrest. "We have withdrawn from a territory where justice has become impossible for us," the letter concluded. "But know this, we observe from afar, and we remember those who have wronged us. Some debts remain to be paid." Handwriting experts confirmed the letter's authenticity, though its point of origin could not be determined. More disturbing than its contents was what it represented: a calculated attempt to reshape the narrative around the James clan's crimes. It suggested that, despite being fugitives, they remained confident enough to directly challenge the official account of their activities. The letter's implicit threat also raised concerns that the family might return to exact revenge on those involved in the investigation. Marshal Hardin ordered increased security for key witnesses and officials, though limited resources meant this protection could not be maintained indefinitely. No further communication was received from any family member until March 1895, when Albert James was arrested in Denver following a bar fight. Initially booked under an alias, his true identity was discovered only after his photograph was circulated to law enforcement agencies. Before Arizona authorities could arrange extradition, however, Albert was found hanging in his cell, an apparent suicide, though many suspected intervention from family members or associates to prevent him from providing information. An examination of Albert's personal effects yielded little useful information, though a hotel key led investigators to a room containing clothing and personal items suggesting a woman had been traveling with him. Witnesses at the hotel described his companion as young and attractive, likely Eliza James, though she had disappeared by the time authorities arrived. The remaining members of the James clan, William, Sarah, Eliza, and Marcus, were never apprehended. Reported sightings continued for years, placing them in locations throughout the West and as far away as Mexico and Canada. None could be substantiated. The most credible theory, supported by banking records discovered in 1899, suggested that the family had escaped to Argentina with a substantial portion of their ill-gotten wealth. Records from a Buenos Aires bank showed an account opened under the name Williams, with an initial deposit equivalent to roughly $50,000, an enormous sum for the time. The signature on the account closely resembled William James's handwriting. Records at the port of New Orleans indicated that a family matching their general description had boarded a vessel bound for South America in late 1893, traveling under the name Williams. The ship's manifest listed William and Sarah Williams, their adult sons Albert and Marcus, and their daughter Elizabeth. The timing and details aligned too closely with the James clan to be coincidental. Territorial authorities briefly considered pursuing extradition but faced numerous obstacles. The evidence connecting the Williams family to the fugitive James clan, while compelling to investigators, was largely circumstantial from a legal perspective. Additionally, diplomatic relations with Argentina at that time were not conducive to a complex extradition case involving crimes committed years earlier. What became of the family thereafter remains unknown. Their disappearance left numerous questions unanswered, most significantly, the fate of Sheriff Malcolm Reynolds. His body was never found, though a badge identified as his was discovered among the possessions at the Canyon camp. The circumstances of his disappearance and presumed death would remain one of the enduring mysteries of the case. The territorial government, concerned about the impact on investment in Arizona's mining industry, made efforts to downplay the extent of the James clan's crimes. Official reports emphasized the isolated nature of the case and the swift response of law enforcement. Newspapers, initially eager to publish sensational details, gradually shifted focus to other matters as editors were pressured by business and political interests. Marshall Hardin, who had led the investigation following Reynolds's disappearance, found his subsequent career stalled. His detailed reports on the case were classified, and he was transferred to a remote posting in northern Arizona. In 1897, he resigned from the territorial service and returned to his native Texas, where he occasionally gave interviews to newspapers about the case despite official discouragement. "They want it forgotten," he told the El Paso Herald in 1901. Too many influential people were connected to the James family, either as unwitting associates or active collaborators. The territorial government fears the impact on investment if the full extent of the corruption became known. By 1896, public mention of the case had largely ceased. The locations associated with the family's activities, their former residence, the Canyon camp, even the sites where their victims had been found, became places that locals avoided, speaking of them only in hushed tones. The most complete record of the case was compiled by James Madison Taylor, a junior deputy who had worked with Sheriff Reynolds and later became a court clerk. Taylor collected official documents, newspaper accounts, and personal recollections from those involved in the investigation, maintaining the archive as an unofficial history of one of Arizona's darkest chapters. In 1902, Taylor attempted to publish his findings as a book titled The Territory's Silent Terror, The True History of the James Clan. No publisher would touch the manuscript, citing concerns about potential legal action from powerful interests who preferred the story remain buried. Taylor's manuscript circulated in private for several years before reportedly being destroyed in a house fire in 1909. Taylor himself died the following year, taking much of the first-hand knowledge of the case to his grave. His widow, Ernestine Taylor, later claimed the fire had been deliberately set. James received threats for years after he began collecting that information, she told a local historian in 1912. Men would watch our house. Strange things would happen. Items moved, papers disturbed. After he died, the attention stopped. They got what they wanted. Occasional references to the James clan appeared in historical accounts of Arizona territory over the following decades, though usually as brief mentions lacking detail. Academic interest in the case revived briefly in the late 1950s when historian Margaret Wilson attempted to reconstruct the events based on surviving documents. Her research was hampered by the mysterious disappearance of key records from the territorial archives. Wilson's incomplete work, published in 1961 as Criminal Enterprises in the Territorial Mining Industry, devoted one chapter to the James case. Even this limited account generated controversy, with several prominent Arizona families objecting to what they termed sensationalized historical fiction. Wilson defended her research, but found further avenues of investigation inexplicably closed to her. "I've encountered resistance at every turn," she wrote to a colleague in 1962. "Archives that should be publicly accessible are suddenly restricted. People who initially agreed to interviews cancel without explanation. I'm beginning to understand why this case has remained obscure despite its historical significance." Wilson abandoned her research shortly thereafter, accepting a position at an East Coast university. Her papers, including notes on the James case that never appeared in her published work, were donated to the university's archives upon her death in 1978. Researchers attempting to access these materials in subsequent years discovered that the relevant files had been removed from the collection at some point with no record of by whom or when. The most recent development in the long-dormant case came in 1968, when construction workers excavating for a highway expansion near Miami, Arizona, uncovered a sealed metal box containing what appeared to be Sheriff Reynolds' missing case notes. The discovery briefly reignited interest in the James clan, but before the documents could be properly examined, they vanished from the county clerk's office where they had been temporarily stored. An investigation into the disappearance produced no suspects or leads. The construction foreman who had originally found the box died in an automobile accident 2 weeks later, adding another layer of mystery to the already enigmatic case. Raymond Chandler, one of the workers present at the discovery, provided a brief description of the contents before they disappeared. There were papers, mostly handwritten, and some photographs that looked real old. The writing I saw mentioned the James family and something about missing miners. There was a badge, too, all tarnished. The foreman said we should turn everything over to the authorities, which we did. Next thing we heard, it had all vanished. Today, physical evidence of the James clan's reign of terror has largely vanished from the Arizona landscape. The mines they coveted have been exhausted or abandoned. The communities where they operated have evolved beyond recognition or faded into ghost towns. Even the canyon where their gruesome camp was discovered has been reclaimed by the wilderness, its exact location lost to living memory. What remains are whispered stories passed down through generations of long-time Arizona residents, tales of a family whose outward respectability masked unimaginable cruelty, of disappearances never solved, of wealth built on blood and suffering. In the mining communities of central Arizona, particularly among older residents, certain names are still not spoken after dark, and certain places are avoided without explicit explanation. Oliver Henderson, a lifelong resident of Globe, who died in 1971 at the age of 93, was perhaps the last person with living memory of the James family. In an interview conducted in 1965, he recalled, "I was just a boy when they lived here, but I remember them well. Mr. James always had a kind word, and sometimes gave me pennies when I'd see him in town. Mrs. James was a handsome woman, always dressed fine, even when most folks were just getting by. They had those children, good-looking, well-behaved. It wasn't until later, after they'd gone, that people started talking about what they'd done. Even then, most wouldn't say much. There was fear still, like they might somehow hear their names spoken. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the James clan's legacy is not what we know, but what remains hidden. How many of their victims lie in unmarked graves throughout the territory, their fates never recorded? How many families spent decades wondering what happened to loved ones who vanished in the mining camps of Arizona? And, perhaps most chillingly, did the James clan truly vanish? Or did they simply transform themselves again, continuing their predatory existence under new identities in some distant location? The historical record suggests they possessed the resources and calculation to establish new lives elsewhere. If they followed the pattern established in Arizona, they would have created respectable facades while pursuing their true nature in carefully concealed privacy. The children raised in this methodical criminality would have carried these practices into a new generation. The last verified document connected to the case is a letter received by the Pinkerton Detective Agency in 1915, purportedly from Marcus James, the youngest son, by then in his 40s. The letter, postmarked from Santiago, Chile, contained only a newspaper clipping about the death of a prominent Arizona businessman and the cryptic message, "The last debt is paid." Pinkerton records indicate an agent was dispatched to investigate, but found no trace of Marcus James in Santiago. The meaning of the message, like so much else about the James clan, remains a mystery buried by time and deliberate obscuration. The businessman mentioned in the clipping was Howard Prescott, a banker who had financed several mining operations in central Arizona during the 1890s. While never publicly linked to the James family's activities, Prescott's name had appeared in Thomas James's ledger as a protected associate. His death, reportedly from natural causes, occurred 3 days before the postmark on Marcus's letter. Subsequent investigation by the Pinkerton agent revealed that Prescott had been found in his study, seated at his desk as if working. The position was reminiscent of the staged tableau of Elias Kramer's body discovered by Joseph Harland in 1892. Though no evidence of foul play was documented in the official death certificate, the coincidence was disturbing enough for the agent to include it in his confidential report. "The possibility exists," he wrote, "that Marcus James or another family member executed Prescott as a final act of what they perceived as justice, or perhaps to eliminate a witness who could connect them to their previous crimes." The deliberate staging of the body suggests a signature consistent with their established methodology. The agent's report was filed away and largely forgotten until a review of cold cases in the 1940s briefly brought it to light again. By then, the trail had grown too cold to pursue further. If Marcus James or other family members had been in Chile in 1915, they had long since moved on, leaving no trace beyond that single, taunting letter. Throughout the early 20th century, rumors occasionally surfaced about the James family's fate. A report from Mexico City in 1920 claimed that William and Sarah James had died there during the influenza pandemic, though no death certificates were ever located. A traveler returning from Buenos Aires in 1927 reported encountering an elderly American woman who called herself Sarah Williams and spoke knowledgeably about Arizona mining operations, though he saw nothing suspicious in this until reading about the case years later. Perhaps the most intriguing lead came in 1935, when a woman claiming to be Eliza James approached a journalist in New York City, offering to tell the true story of her family for a substantial payment. Before negotiations could be completed, however, the woman disappeared from her hotel, leaving behind only a note that read, "Some stories are best left untold." The journalist, Theodore Barrett, subsequently published a speculative article about the encounter in a literary magazine, describing the woman as remarkably preserved for her apparent age, speaking with the refined accent of someone educated in better circumstances than her current situation suggested. He noted that she displayed no remorse when discussing her family's alleged crimes, only a detached analytical interest in how the events were perceived historically. The journalist, initially skeptical, became convinced of her authenticity after she provided details of the case that had never been publicly reported. She spoke of necessary eliminations and business acquisitions rather than murders, Barrett wrote. When I suggested that her family's actions had caused immense suffering, she regarded me with genuine puzzlement, as if I had made an observation about rainfall affecting a picnic, a minor inconvenience rather than a moral concern. Barrett's article generated little attention at the time, dismissed by most as sensationalism. Years later, crime historians would recognize the psychological profile he described as consistent with what modern analysts would term psychopathic personality traits, the same clinical detachment evident in Sarah James's journals from the Canyon Camp. The case of the James clan represents a historical anomaly, a family-based criminal enterprise that operated with corporate efficiency rather than the impulsive violence typical of frontier outlaws. Their methodology presaged the organized crime syndicates that would emerge in urban America decades later, though with a level of familial cohesion rarely seen even in those organizations. Criminologists who have studied the fragmentary records suggest that the James family exemplified a perfect storm of pathological traits. William's strategic intelligence and ability to project respectability, Sarah's clinical sadism masked by maternal gentility, the children raised from birth to view their victims as mere obstacles to acquisition rather than fellow humans. Together, they created a predatory unit uniquely adapted to exploit the fluid social structures and limited law enforcement of the territorial frontier. What made them particularly effective and particularly difficult to bring to justice was their ability to maintain dual identities. Unlike typical outlaws who operated outside society, the James clan functioned within it, leveraging the respectability afforded by wealth and social position to conceal their true nature. In many ways, wrote criminologist Richard Danvers in a 1979 analysis, they represented a far more dangerous category of criminal than the famous outlaws of the period. Jesse James and his ilk announced their criminality through their actions, operating in opposition to society. The Arizona James clan operated within society's structures, corrupting them from within. Their victims never saw the threat until it was too late, because predator and prey shared the same social spaces, the same churches, the same civic organizations. This duality extended to their methods as well. While capable of extreme violence, they employed it selectively and privately, preferring manipulation and coercion when possible. The torture described in recovered documents appears to have served multiple purposes: extraction of information certainly, but also the satisfaction of sadistic impulses carefully channeled into productive activities that furthered the family's goals. Most disturbing to modern analysts is the intergenerational nature of their criminality. Unlike most criminal families where children might be kept ignorant of their parents' activities or gradually initiated into them, the James children appear to have been raised from earliest awareness to participate in the family enterprise. Sarah's journals suggest a deliberate education in techniques of manipulation, deception, and ultimately torture, with the children's natural empathy systematically suppressed. What we see in the James case, noted forensic psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Merrill in a 2005 retrospective, is essentially the creation of artificial psychopaths, individuals whose natural human capacity for empathy was deliberately stunted through systematic training, much as one might train a child in mathematics or music. The children were taught to view other humans as resources to be exploited, rather than as fellow beings worthy of moral consideration. This psychological conditioning explains the clinical detachment observed in their methods, the careful staging of victims, and the complete absence of remorse in the limited first-hand accounts. It also explains why the family could function so effectively as a unit despite engaging in behaviors that would typically generate internal conflict in normal family groups. The legacy of the James clan extends beyond their direct victims. The corruption they fostered within Arizona's early institutions, bribing officials, blackmailing associates, eliminating opponents, undermined the territory's development toward effective governance. Their ability to manipulate the emerging financial and legal systems demonstrated vulnerabilities that would be exploited by others in subsequent decades. More subtly, their activities contributed to a culture of silence and fear that persisted long after they had fled. Communities where they had operated remained reluctant to discuss certain topics or investigate certain disappearances even generations later. The whispered warnings passed down through families, "Avoid this canyon, don't ask about that abandoned mine," created a geography of dread that outlasted living memory of the events themselves. In the shadow of the Superstition Mountains, they say the wind sometimes carries voices from the past, whispers of secrets still kept, of justice never served, of a darkness that once moved through the mining camps of Arizona Territory, methodically building an empire on foundations of unspeakable cruelty. The James clan may have vanished from history, their crimes deliberately obscured by those who preferred that such darkness remain hidden. But in the silent canyons and abandoned mines of central Arizona, something of their presence lingers, a reminder that the most terrifying predators are not those who announce themselves with violence and spectacle, but those who move quietly among us, their monstrous nature concealed behind masks of respectability and charm. In a forgotten collection of personal papers donated to the Arizona Historical Society in 1954, there is a single photograph believed to show the James family taken at a social gathering in Globe circa 1890. They stand together, William, Sarah, Thomas, Albert, Marcus, and Eliza, smiling pleasantly at the camera, indistinguishable from the respectable citizens surrounding them. Nothing in their appearance suggests the horror they inflicted on countless victims. Nothing marks them as different from any other frontier family seeking prosperity in the developing territory. That is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of their story, the mundane appearance of evil, the monsters who looked just like everyone else. In 1952, an elderly woman being treated for terminal illness in a San Diego hospital made a deathbed confession to her nurse. She claimed to be Eliza James and spoke of numerous murders committed by her family throughout the Southwest. Hospital records indicate the woman died before authorities could interview her, and her body was cremated before any verification of identity could be attempted. The attending nurse's written account of the confession was dismissed by police as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, though several details corresponded with non-public aspects of the case. Whether this was actually Eliza James remains unknown. If true, it would suggest at least one member of the family had returned to the United States and lived out a long life in obscurity, perhaps with a new identity established in the chaotic aftermath of the First World War, when record-keeping was disrupted and identities more easily assumed. The possibility that descendants of the James clan might still exist, perhaps unaware of their ancestral history, adds another layer of unease to an already disturbing narrative. Did the family's pathological traits persist through generations? Or did their line end in South America, their blood money eventually exhausted, their criminal dynasty fading into history? Some secrets, it seems, the desert keeps forever. Throughout the mining communities of Arizona, on nights when the wind moans through abandoned shafts and the moon casts long shadows across empty streets, old-timers still sometimes speak of the James family, not the famous outlaws from Missouri, but the quiet, respectable clan who brought a calculated terror to the territory and vanished like smoke when justice finally approached. Their story serves as a warning that true evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flourish. It moves quietly among us, smiling pleasantly, speaking softly, establishing trust, until the moment the mask drops and the predator is revealed. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the James clan isn't the violence they inflicted or the wealth they accumulated through murder. It's the fact that they nearly succeeded in erasing themselves from history, that their crimes were deliberately obscured by powerful interests, that even now we cannot be certain of the full extent of their activities or the final fate of those who perpetrated them. The shadowy canyon where their camp was discovered has long since been reclaimed by the wilderness. The graves of their victims have been lost to time and erosion. The records of their crimes have vanished from archives or remain sealed in forgotten repositories. All that remains are fragments, enough to reconstruct an outline of their reign of terror, but never the complete picture. And perhaps that incomplete knowledge is the most unsettling legacy of all, the sense that some truths are simply too disturbing to be fully recovered, that some darkness resists even the most determined effort to bring it into the light. The next time you drive through the mining towns of central Arizona, between Globe and Tombstone, between Phoenix and the Superstition Mountains, look at the weathered buildings that have stood since territorial days. Consider the forgotten graves in overgrown cemeteries. Listen to the wind moving through canyons where old paths have vanished beneath a century of dust. Somewhere in that landscape lie the last traces of the James clan's passage, the family that history forgot, the predators who wore the masks of respectable citizens, the darkness that once moved through these communities, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Some say that on certain nights, in certain remote canyons, the echo of screams can still be heard, the final protests of those who discovered too late the true nature of the family they had welcomed into their midst. Most dismiss such tales as the typical ghost stories that accumulate around any place with a troubled history. But those who know the full story of the James clan might wonder if there isn't some truth behind the legends, not supernatural perhaps, but the lingering psychological imprint of calculated cruelty so extreme that it seems to have marked the very landscape where it occurred. The James clan's true legacy isn't just the lives they took or the wealth they accumulated. It's the reminder that evil can wear the most benign faces, that monsters walk among us unrecognized, that history itself can be manipulated to conceal uncomfortable truths. Their story wasn't preserved in dime novels or celebrated in frontier ballads. It was deliberately buried, obscured, forgotten, which is perhaps exactly what they would have wanted. The final victory of predators who understood that anonymity was their greatest protection. But fragments remain, waiting for those willing to piece them together, to remember what others chose to forget, to speak names that others would rather leave unspoken. In the end, this isn't just the story of a criminal family from a bygone era. It's a warning that echoes through time about the masks people wear, about the darkness that can hide behind respectable facades, about the selective memory that allows communities to forget their most troubling chapters. The James clan may have vanished from Arizona territory in 1893, but their kind has never disappeared from human society. They walk among us still, wearing different names, but bearing the same predatory nature, seeking vulnerability, exploiting trust, moving through the world not as members of our human community, but as wolves among sheep. Remember them, not for glory or infamy, but as a reminder to look beneath surfaces, to question too perfect facades, to recognize that the most dangerous threats rarely announce themselves with convenient warnings. Some debts, as Marcus James wrote in his final taunting letter, may eventually be paid, but others remain outstanding, the debt of justice never served, of history incompletely told, of warnings unheeded across generations. In the silence of the Arizona desert, those debts remain, whispering on the wind that moves through forgotten canyons where unspeakable things once occurred in the name of profit and power. Listen carefully. The desert remembers, even when history forgets.